So hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Med School with Shubham. I am Shubham Mane, a third professional MBBS student, and I shall be teaching you anatomy. I have started a series on embryology on my YouTube channel in which I have completed the entire general embryology and also started the systemic embryology. In the systemic embryology, I have completed the pharyngeal arches, the development and the development of the face. And today I will be teaching you about the development of the palate. Guys, I have a small request. If you have not watched my previous lectures, I request you please go on my YouTube channel and watch all the previous lectures of embryology. And so let's get started with today's lecture, that is development of the palate. So for the development of the palate, we require two components, that is the primary palate and the secondary palate. The primary palate and the secondary palate. Now, and these primary and the secondary palate, they will fuse together and now they will be forming a complete palate. Okay. So what is primary palate, what is secondary palate, we will be discussing now. Okay. So now, what actually is a palate? So if you touch the upper side of your oral cavity with your tongue, you will find something hard over it, or the roof of the oral cavity over here, that is hard thing, and on the posterior side it is a soft thing. So the entire thing is the palate. On the anterior side it is the anterior 2/3 is the hard palate. On the posterior 1/3 is the soft palate, and the extension of the palate on the most posterior side is called as the uvula. Okay. So now what actually so now you have understand what is palate. So palate, it forms the, so what is above to the palate? So the above to the palate we have the nasal cavity. So palate forms the separation between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. So this is palate. Here you have the oral cavity and here you have the nasal cavity. So this is the hard palate and this is the soft palate and this is the uvula. Hard palate, soft palate and the uvula. And here you have the nasal cavity and here you have the mouth cavity or the oral cavity. Okay. So the palate will be forming from the primary palate and the secondary palate. So let's start. What actually is primary palate, what actually is secondary palate. So if I open my mouth, I will get an arch like thing over here. Arch like thing. Okay. So I'll be drawing the same arch over here. So this is the arch. Okay. Now in the anterior side, just wait. In the anterior side over here, you will be having the medial nasal process. Now you will ask, from where did this medial nasal process came? From where did this medial nasal process come? So the upper part or the near to the philtrum of the lip, we have the medial nasal process. See this thing. If you have watched my previous lecture, you can relate this very well. So this is the medial nasal process and the same thing is going inside. So this is the medial nasal process I am drawing, and other part of the arch, that is in the center, we have the medial nasal process, and other part of the arch we have the maxillary process. Okay. So now I'll be drawing the maxillary process over here. So this is the maxillary process. Yes. Okay. Now what will happen? From the medial nasal process, I will get an extension inside over here. So till now, one more thing, till now this is the palate which is not yet formed. So we have to make the palate over here. So the first extension that we will get is this thing from the medial nasal process, the extension of the medial nasal process, and it is called as the, this extension, it is called as the premaxilla. Premaxilla. Okay. Premaxilla. Also there will be extensions from this maxillary process over here, and these extensions of the maxillary process, those are called as the palatine process. palatine process. One more very interesting thing, this premaxilla is nothing but the primary palate. The premaxilla is the primary palate and the palatine process is the secondary palate. I hope you understood this. Now, this is the premaxilla and this is the palatine process or the lateral palatine process. Some books even say lateral palatine process and premaxilla as the medial palatine process. Let's just keep this simple, that this is the palatine process and this is the premaxilla. Even if you write this lateral palatine process, it's not wrong. Okay, but this premaxilla is important. You should write premaxilla. So now what will happen? It will start growing even more further in this way, in this way. And now all these three things will now fuse together, and then all these things will now fuse together and then they will form a palate over here. Okay. So let's make that once again. This is the arch of the mouth. Then in the anterior side you have the premaxilla and then this is the palate. Okay. So in this way the entire palate is formed. But now what happens? Initially this palate is very, it's not a hard palate and soft palate till now. It's what is premaxilla and palatine process? These are mesenchymal or mesodermal extensions. These are mesodermal extension. So initially the palate is just like a membrane like of thing, or you can just say a thin cartilage or like a ligament, or not ligament, a thin membrane like of thing. It's just a layer of mesenchyme or the mesoderm. Further what happens? The anterior 2/3 part of this palate, the anterior 2/3 part of this palate, it gets ossified. Okay, let me write that also. So the anterior 2/3 part of this, it will get ossified, and now it will form the hard palate, and the posterior part will not get ossified, and then it will form the soft palate, and the most posterior part, it will form an extension over here. Actually this it will only grow in this way, and then it will also fuse together, and then a uvula will be formed. This is the uvula. Okay, so we got the hard palate, we got the soft palate, and we got the uvula. I hope this is very clear. What are the two components that we require? The primary palate and the secondary palate. The primary palate is the premaxilla. It is derived from the medial nasal process. The medial nasal process will give rise to the premaxilla. And what is secondary palate? It is the palatine process. Who will give rise to palatine process? The maxillary process will give rise to the palatine process or the lateral palatine process. Now all these three things, that is the premaxilla, this side like the palatine process and this side the palatine process, they will fuse together, and now they will grow in this way. It will also grow in this way. It will also grow in this way, and now it will fuse together. All of this will fuse together, and now they will form in this way, and now they will form the entire palate. In this entire palate, the anterior 2/3 part will get ossified, and that will form the hard palate. The posterior 1/3 part will not get ossified, and it will form the soft palate, and the most posterior part, it will be called as the uvula. I hope this is very clear to you guys. Now let's come to the clinical anatomy. Clinical anatomy or the developmental defects. Okay, so now what will happen? One more important thing, this point of fusion of both the palatine process and the premaxilla is called as the incisive fossa. Incisive fossa. In head and neck gross anatomy also you can find this incisive fossa, through which the one artery goes into the nasal cavity. Okay, now let's learn about We have this incisive fossa. Now let's learn about the clinical anatomy. What will happen? Now the first clinical anatomy is, if the palatine process doesn't fuse with, if this palatine process, it doesn't fuse with the premaxilla. If the palatine process doesn't fuse with the premaxilla, then what will happen? In the anterior side, there will be a breach or there will be a cleft between in the palate. In this region, if it doesn't get fused, then it will form the anterior cleft palate because it is in the anterior side. So if the palatine process doesn't fuse with the premaxilla, then it will cause the anterior cleft palate. If it takes place in one side, then it is the ipsilateral anterior cleft palate. If it takes place in both sides, then bilateral anterior cleft palate. Next thing, if both the palatine process doesn't fuse with each other, if this both palatine process doesn't fuse with each other, then it fuse with the premaxilla. It will fuse with the premaxilla, but it doesn't fuse with each other. So you will get a breach over here in this way. It is called as posterior cleft palate. Okay. Now what will happen? If all the three components will not fuse with each other, means premaxilla, this side lateral nasal palatine process and this side lateral palatine. If they doesn't fuse with each other, then it will cause a complete cleft palate. Okay. And also what will happen? If the palatine process doesn't fuse in the uvula part, it will cause the bifid uvula. Means this uvula will be two components will be there of this uvula, that is called as bifid uvula. I hope this is very clear. So the first one was the anterior cleft palate, The second was the posterior cleft palate. The anterior cleft palate can be ipsilateral or unilateral or the bilateral. Ipsilateral can also be called as unilateral. So unilateral or bilateral posterior cleft palate. And third, you have the complete cleft palate. Okay. And the last one is the bifid uvula. I hope this is very clear to you guys. This was all about the development of the palate. You just have to know two types of palate: primary palate, secondary palate. The other two components of this palate. Primary palate is the premaxilla, secondary palate is the palatine process. Premaxilla arises from the medial nasal process and the palatine process arises from the maxillary process. All these three things will now fuse together and now they will form the entire palate. In this entire palate, the anterior two-third will get ossified and then this is called as the hard palate. The posterior one-third will not get ossified, it is called as soft palate, and the most posterior, the posterior most part, it will be called as the uvula. Talking about the clinical anatomy, if the palatine process doesn't fuse with the premaxilla, it is called as anterior cleft palate. If both the palatine process doesn't fuse with each other, it is called as posterior cleft palate. If all the three components, that is premaxilla and both the palatine process doesn't fuse with each other, it is called as complete cleft palate. And we also have, if only the uvula part palatine process doesn't fuse with each other, it is called as the bifid uvula. I hope this is very clear to you guys. I hope you like the video. So please like my video, share my video and also subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you so much guys.